is next, and after that, it looks like Isaacson, Coates, and Carper. Senator Cardin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to join the praise to you, Ambassador Froman, for your consultation with us, your working with us, the open way that we've been able to work together and share views and share the challenges we have on a trade agenda. So I very much appreciate the manner in which you have involved us in the process. As Chairman Hatch pointed out, we have a challenge, and the challenge is that TPP is so far along the way. Normally, we would have had a TPA enacted. We would have voiced our negotiating objectives. You would have come back to us with consultation on those trade objectives, negotiating objectives, and we would have had a chance to adjust our expectations along the way. Well, TPP is so far along the way that becomes somewhat awkward whether TPA really will work in the way that it was intended to work with congressional input. I mention that because you know my number one concern. My number one concern is in TPP that TPA has very strong negotiating objectives as it relates to good governance, as it relates to anti-corruption issues. We are dealing with countries that are challenging in TPP. Brunei, where the LGBT community has legitimate human rights concerns. In Brunei and Malaysia and in Vietnam, their record on labor is very suspect. And on anti-corruption, they could pass laws, but they don't have the institutions, the independent prosecutors and courts, to give us confidence that they would enforce those laws. So my priority from the beginning, and I think I've been very open about it, is that our trading objectives be very strong on good governance because of the TPP negotiations. And that, yes, we are concerned to make sure that we continue to have a level playing field on environment, on labor protections, but also on good governance, anti-corruption, and, as Senator Schumer said, enforcement. Because if it's not enforceable under trade sanctions, it becomes very difficult to see whether we really elevated. And for those who are concerned, as I know some of my colleagues are, about mixing trade and human rights, let me just remind you that it was U.S. leadership in trade that helped change the apartheid government of South Africa. It was the U.S. leadership that spoke to the Soviet Union and their human rights on immigration through Jackson Vanik that brought about change. It is critically important that if we're going to see change in Vietnam and Malaysia and Brunei and other countries that do not have that record, that we use this opportunity to achieve those objectives. So I will be evaluating very carefully not just what we do on TPA, because we're so far down the line on TPP, also an open process on both TPP and TPA as it deals with human rights and good governance. I want to ask one more question and then have your response on that in the second question. And that is, TPA would deal with more than TPP. It would deal with TTIP, as you've already pointed out. And there's a growing concern with our European partners that they are sympathetic to BDS legislation, dealing with boycotts, divestitures, and sanctions. And I'd be interested as to, in those discussions, whether we have been raising the issues that such action by our European partners would be considered to be against our overall trading objectives, and whether we are using TTIP as an opportunity to protect against such legislation. I'd be glad to hear your comments on both of my points.
Well, thank you, Senator, and thank you for your leadership on the human rights and governance issues. TPP, in fact, does have strong governance and anti-corruption provisions in them, and really it's one of the innovations of TPP to make that a core part of the agreement, and it really goes throughout the whole agreement with regard to transparency, regulatory transparency, and across the board. And of course, it's got strong enforcement mechanisms generally in the agreement. So we agree with you on the importance of that. TPP has also given us an opportunity to engage with countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei on the kinds of issues that you've mentioned. So with regard to labor rights, for example, we are in deep consultations with these countries about what it would take to bring their labor regime into conformity with international standards, not just in terms of changing laws, as you said, but also what kind of capacity building, what kind of practice is necessary to really have changes on the ground. And it's only because of TPP that we have the opportunity, to have that kind of dialogue with Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. And even on the human rights issue with Brunei, which has been raised, we're working very closely with the State Department, which has the lead on the human rights issues, but with the opportunity the TPP gives us to engage with them about their practices and ensure that what they do is consistent with their international human rights obligations. So I feel good that through TPP we'll be able to make progress in all those areas, and that TPP will set a new milestone in terms of good governance, anti-corruption, and improving labor rights across the board. On the European issue, I'm not familiar with that particular area of legislation. It's not something that's come up in our negotiations yet, but we're happy to follow up with you and look into it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.